You would think writing dialogue would be so easy. It's one of the most familiar things in our lives. Every day we listen to other people speak and we speak ourselves. We are extremely familiar with the rhythm of spoken dialogue. But unfortunately, written dialogue is not the same as spoken dialogue. If you want to test that theory, go grab a transcript from one of your favorite shows and just read it dry as though it's dialogue in a novel. It's not going to sound very good. So let's talk about a few practical things you can do to make your dialogue sound great and read very well on the page. I'm Victoria, author, editor, and owner of Blue Pen, where I manage a team of professional editors and book designers. Strengthening dialogue is one of the key things that happens during line editing. It is a constant challenge to create and maintain a character's unique voice while also making sure that the dialogue reads well. Written dialogue is different than spoken dialogue. It is often less exaggerated. For example, when you're writing accents and dialects, less is more. I am from the South, so I do know a bit about accents. I find that my own accent kind of goes away when I'm recording these videos, but you can trust me that it comes out when I'm angry or when I'm around my mama. When you're listening to general conversation in the South, you're probably going to hear a lot of slurred syllables. We're going to leave off parts of certain words and turn what should be one syllable into two. And when someone is speaking in real life, that sort of thing happens almost constantly, because they're fairly consistent with their speech patterns. But if we are writing a sentence and using apostrophes at the end of every single word, it's not going to be readable. The reader is really going to have to parse out what it means because we don't consume written words like spoken dialogue. When we're listening to something, we can understand a lot more easily what that means than when we're reading it on the page. So when you're writing dialogue and you're trying to get the accent or the dialect across, all you really need to do is drop in a hint here and there. Readers are smart and brains are exceptional at filling in gaps in information. So if you drop in a few examples of, say, a Southern accent, the reader's brain is going to understand that this character is speaking with a Southern accent and will fill that in and will hear those lines in a Southern accent. So generally speaking, there's no need to overdo it. As with all writing advice, there are exceptions to everything. If you are writing a piece where you are really, really trying to highlight that accent or dialect, then that might be a different scenario. The same rule applies to stutters and stammers. If you go overboard with this, it's going to become very, very distracting. So try to minimize their use and the reader will understand that this character has a stutter or a stammer. With that, also try to keep it consistent. Most people tend to stutter on the same consonants, so pay attention to where exactly your character has issues with that and try to be as consistent as possible. Another element of dialogue that we want to use sparingly is explicit pauses, especially ellipses. This is one of those things that it's very easy to overuse in writing because it's so often used naturally in speech. We always have pauses. I'm sure if you rewind a second, you'll hear several pauses in that previous sentence as I was thinking and considering what I was going to say. We often have natural pauses in our speech. But when you use an ellipses in your dialogue, it does not come off as a natural pause. It is emphasized, and it can be very jarring for the reader, especially if you are using multiple ellipses. Oftentimes we can just remove the ellipsis. My go-to method here is to remove it, read the sentence back, and ask yourself, honestly, has it lost anything? If the answer is no, then don't use it. Sometimes you can also replace the ellipsis with a description of action, an action beat. And that can be more effective than the ellipsis because it gives you the opportunity to add further information about what's happening, sensory information that can help the reader really feel like they're immersed in the story. Of course, there are places that we do want to use ellipses, and by using them sparingly, they are more effective when we do use them. On the topic of ellipses, according to the Chicago Manual of Style, which is the default style guide for fiction in the United States, the best way to format that is going to be with non-breaking spaces. Using non-breaking spaces prevents the periods from separating onto different lines. You can also just use the ellipses symbol, which will come up automatically in most software if you just type 3 periods, and your editor or interior designer will change that formatting. Now, the fourth way to write dialogue that is very easy to grasp and understand and doesn't pull the reader out of the story is to make sure you are identifying the speaker. The reader should never have to stop and ask, "Now, who said that?" If they do, then you have just broken the flow of the story. You have pulled the reader out of the story, and now they're standing there going, okay, now I have to back up. I have to figure out what was going on, who said that. Let's read the previous paragraph again, and then keep going. And that is pretty much worst case scenario. Now, you'll see some rules about how often to identify the speaker. Some people say every 3 lines, every 4 lines, but it really just depends. If you have 2 speakers having a conversation, then it's going to be pretty easy to keep track of. But especially if there are 3 or more speakers involved, you are really going to want to make sure they are identified. And my rule with that is just if there is a chance that the reader will not understand, if there is any reasonable possibility of ambiguity, go ahead and identify the speaker. And that leads us into the 5th tip, which is to keep your dialogue tags simple. Some writers really just have a tendency to get super creative with dialogue tags and want to use creative verbs for every single one. Never use he said, she said, but that can get very, very distracting for a reader. Basically, when a reader sees he, she, or they said or asked, they're just going to filter that out. At this point, those phrases are kind of like punctuation to us. They are so familiar that when we read them, we understand their meaning, we take their meaning without it breaking the flow of the story. We don't zoom in on those. However, if we read something that says, she wheezed, or he grumbled, then we're going to notice that. And that is going to detract from the actual dialogue. Again, when we use those sparingly, then they have more impact when we do use them. So default to said and keep everything else for the moments when it really counts. One of the most important pieces of advice that I have for dialogue, and really this has to do with showing versus telling, is to use action beats whenever possible. So when you are reading a piece of dialogue, if the character says something and then the character does something, whether or not that character is identified by a he said, she said, a dialogue tag, you're going to understand that the character doing the thing is the character who was speaking. So, an example, no one will know, enclosed in quotation marks, Maggie dumped the glass shards in the trash. We understand, even though there was not a dialogue tag, that Maggie was the one who spoke that previous piece of dialogue because it was immediately followed with her doing an action. Now, this works the other way around as well. If a character does something and then there's a piece of dialogue, we understand that the character doing the thing is also the character who spoke the dialogue. Now, this action beat is going to be stronger because it is giving us sensory information. We see what's happening. It is also considered redundant to use both. So you do not need to use a dialogue tag and an action beat because one will suffice. And if one will suffice, we want to use the stronger of the two, which is going to be the action beat. So prioritize action beats over dialogue tags and don't use both. Now, one of the coolest tools that I like to use to really focus in on my dialogue and make sure it's consistent and kind of see how it's reading is in Scrivener, linguistic focus. So if you have Scrivener, go to linguistic focus and choose direct speech. And what that will do is actually fade everything back except your dialogue. So you'll see on the page your dialogue will be basically highlighted, and you can just really focus on that and go through and see how it's reading. And that's a really good time to read your dialogue out loud, even though, as we've talked about, spoken dialogue and written dialogue are not the same. There is still a benefit to reading it out loud and hearing that rhythm and kind of feeling how the words would be if spoken. If you're not familiar with Scrivener, I definitely suggest checking it out. I will drop a link in the description box to where you can get a 30-day free trial. So those are my tips for writing strong dialogue. The key points: written dialogue is not the same as spoken dialogue. So don't try to write exactly how you would speak. Action beats are always stronger than dialogue tags. So prioritize action and don't use both. And less is more. Try not to overuse creative dialogue tags and punctuation. That can become distracting for the reader and can pull them out of the story. And of course, focus on developing a unique voice for each of your characters, and then be consistent with that voice. Okay, I hope this was helpful as you move forward with your writing. If you decide to pursue professional editing, the team at Bluepen would love to help. You can get in touch with us at bluepenbooks.com/contact. Subscribe for new videos and let me know in the comments, do you have any tips for writing dialogue that maybe I didn't mention? That's it for now. Happy writing, and I'll see y'all next time.